So today we're going to be talking about HBAC, home birth after cesarean. And a lot of times this gets swept under the rug. People do not talk about this enough because oftentimes when you're seeking VBAC support, you go to a VBAC tolerant care provider and they tell you, we don't do home birth. So if you go to a midwife and you ask for a home birth after cesarean, they may tell you it's not allowed. Well, there's a little bit more to it than that, and I will tell you more about that inside this video. But first, I want to share a story with you. It's the story of my friend Christine. You may have heard this before, but my friend Christine worked with me as a rally coordinator for improving birth in Abbotsford when we first became birth advocates. We were so fed up once we discovered as first-time moms that we'd essentially been tricked into a hospital birth and hospital experience that we hadn't wanted with our births. Christine had been planning a natural birth and she'd hired a midwife and she was taking the same classes that I was taking and she was reading the same books that I was reading. But what happened is she went to 42 weeks and then suddenly her midwife said, I'm sorry, that's the cutoff. If you go past 42 weeks with me, we're going to have to transfer you to an OB. And then the OB had said, well, you can go to 43 weeks with me, although there's a lot of doubt whether that was actually going to be allowed or if he was just going to keep scaring her until she had an induction. But the fact remains is that she was pushed into an induction that she didn't need because she's naturally a 42-week mama. That's when she gestates her babies. She gestates them to 42 weeks and a little bit beyond. And with her first baby, she was not ready to give birth yet at 42 weeks. And with her second, she was 41 weeks and I think 4 days. So in the end, she ended up almost going to 42 weeks with her second baby. Here's the difference. In her first pregnancy, she was feeling a lot of pressure to induce. And she was getting all of the mainstream birth education that was basically telling her that she needed to go to the hospital and that that was the safest place for her. And she trusted in that system and ultimately wound up traumatized. And she said to me afterwards, I will help you with our rallies and everything. And I will continue to be a birth advocate, but I don't think I'm ever going to get pregnant again. In fact, she and her husband scheduled a vasectomy for him. And just before his appointment, Christine found out she was pregnant. So they were already like, we are not having kids. And then they had this surprise baby. Miraculously, this happened at the same time that I was pregnant with my daughter, Michaela. So I was all excited. I'm like, oh my God, like you and I are pregnant again at the same time. Our babies are all going to be close in age. That's amazing. And this is going to be different this time. And in the beginning, Christine had even said, you know what, like I've been so traumatized by my C-section that I don't know if I even want to go through labor again because I don't want the same thing to happen. So I'll probably just schedule a C-section. And she said that for a very long time. So our kids are 2 years apart in age. So her son and my son they were born back in 2013 and our daughters were born in 2016. So we kind of had all this time to really learn and have that education as rally coordinators and all the work we were doing in our community. And we knew the hospital system better than most people. We were also talking to doulas at that time. We were inside the Fraser Valley Birth Network, which is a group of midwives, nurses, and doulas that were working within the Fraser Valley. It was like a support group. And there was also some workshops. There was some teaching. We would have some speakers come in. And Christine and I attended these meetings together. And in that time, she said to me, you know, I would really love to have a home birth like you're planning with your daughter. I really would. But it's just going to be too much of a fight for me to get that. So instead, I'm going to just go ahead and have a hospital birth, and I'll just go in at the last possible minute so I don't have to get on the bed and I don't have to be strapped to the monitor. Okay, so I knew, and this is the secret I'm going to tell you, I knew that Christine could do this. If she really wanted a home birth, she could have a freaking home birth. If she wanted to have a home birth after cesarean, that was basically the default. And I kept saying to her, it's like, well, you know, like technically you can have a home birth. They can't make you go to the hospital. But she's like, yeah, I know, but it's just going to be such a fight. And the midwives have the policy. And I really just don't want to make any waves. Well, then we flash forward to the day of her labor. And Christine is laboring along and she's doing really well. She's never had a natural labor without Pitocin. So of course she thinks that these contractions are like easy peasy, nothing to it. Like she's just like, oh my God, like this is so easy. This, like, when does the actual labor happen? And I couldn't really be there to tell what sounds she was making at the time. I hadn't had any doula training yet. This is back when I was just an advocate and I was working with my own birth. But I had this idea based on what I had just gone through with my daughter that maybe she had prodromal labor, I thought. Turns out Christine just had a very easy, slow labor where it was like the contractions would space out and then they get closer together and they get a little bit more intense and then they'd space out. And I noticed this happens a lot with moms who have had previous cesareans. So this happened with Lisa, one of my clients, and with Rebecca as well. When I was working with Rebecca back in October and attending her birth through Zoom, I was actually timing the contractions just out of curiosity. And they followed the same pattern that Christine's had. So I have a theory, though it's not completely proven, because a lot of studies on home birth after cesarean, they have very small sample sizes. So when they say that there's no evidence for something, what you need to know is that it just means they haven't been able to do a study. And there's a lot of ethical complications involved in trying to get a whole bunch of pregnant women into one big study for whatever they want to test. Usually the big studies happen because the medical community wants to prove that their intervention or their medication is good for everybody, so that then they can make more money and control the process. But anytime that you want to do a autonomous birth, a natural birth, physiological birth, home birth, the studies are very small because it's a very small number of people in the population that are actually realizing that they have this power and that they can do that. Society has done a very good job, as has the medical community, of scaring moms into thinking they have to have a hospital birth and they have to have something incredibly controlled. And that's why I really love HBAC, because these moms have gone through that system and they've experienced what happens when your birth is controlled. And the thing about even VBAC in the hospital is that oftentimes that's heavily controlled. In fact, it's even more heavily controlled than if you had no previous C-section, because of the fact that now you have the high risk VBAC label on you. So they will want the monitor on you. They might even try to push for an internal fetal monitor. They'll be basically making sure that you're progressing at a 1 centimeter per hour rate. They'll be freaking out about the possibility of uterine rupture, which is also linked to Pitocin and to stronger contractions than what your body is actually designed to handle. And this is where my theory again comes in, because if your labor is spacing out and shifting the baby, and the contractions are only getting as strong as they need to do what it needs to do, and no stronger than that, and then it eases off for a bit, and then it starts up, it's like working a muscle that has been injured, because that's what's happened. Your uterus is a muscle and it has been injured, possibly more than once it's been injured. So naturally, what's going to happen is that you're going to have possibly a lot of prodromal labor, or your labor is just going to have a very odd pattern that seems like it's failure to progress. Actually, it's just failure to wait. And you might not even feel a lot of pain, especially if you were induced the first time. So this is what happened with Christine, is that she was like, oh, well, you know, this is probably not really intense or anything. Eventually, she did call the doula. And then when things got really intense, she's like, okay, maybe now it's time to go to the hospital because I must be in active labor by this point. I'm probably at least 6 centimeters. Christine didn't make it past the door. So she got to her front door and all of a sudden, whoosh, her water's released. And she realized in that moment, as she'd been doing hypnobirthing, that, oh, wait a minute, all this pressure is my baby and I can't get to the hospital now. So they called the midwife to the house. And then the midwife checked and she's like, actually, you do have time enough that we can get you to the hospital, because she lived relatively close to the hospital. And Christine asked one question: do I have to get on the bed? Because the last time that Christine had been on the bed, she just absolutely hated laboring on the bed. She hated being strapped to that stupid monitor. And I do not blame her, because I had to birth on the bed too, and I hated it. I hated every minute of it. So I didn't blame her for a second. And I was really proud of her when she told me that she asked this question. And the midwife said, actually, yeah, that's a policy. And the paramedics agreed. And she said, then I'm staying here. And so the midwife sent the paramedics away. And she was like, okay, let's do this. And Christine birthed her baby girl in her living room. She had a surprise home birth after cesarean. And she told me this the next day. She sent me and my friend Wendy a message because we had a group chat going. It's very similar to what I do with my Take Charge of Birth program students, in which we have a group chat feature where you just come in and you get that right support, that cheerleading, that love, that energy. So we basically had built that. Wendy was done having kids, but she'd had a VBAC after 3 cesareans. So she was all for Christine having this beautiful HBAC. And I, of course, had just had my home birth with Michaela not too long ago. And I was just so excited for her to finally join us in an empowered birth. So she had that loving support. And then she's like, I'm going to go and do my thing and rest. And then we didn't hear from her for the rest of the day and the rest of the night. And I'm like, well, it was probably prodromal labor. And then in the morning, we get the text and she's like, I had an HBAC. And I'm like, what? Sweet. I'm so excited for you. And we were just so blown away by this. And if you want to know more, Christine does share her story. So you can hear more about that inside of our Facebook group in the guides section under the Empowered Birth Stories. Anyway, the reason why I wanted to tell you about this is because of the fact that Christine thought that she couldn't have an HBAC because our health authority is very restrictive and says, if you've had a cesarean, you have to birth in the hospital. And all the midwives have been told, if your client has a cesarean, you have to push her into the hospital. You can't serve her. Now, some of them do go against that, and they do fudge the details a little, and they help their clients through that. I'm not saying that there aren't those people out there, but there's others who are so scared to step on the toes of the health authority that they will just outright say, I'm sorry, I can't take you on as a client because you want a home birth, and we aren't allowed to serve you if you want to have a home birth. So all midwives are not created equal. In fact, my friend Michelle Tiliakos just shared a video on this, a quick Instagram reel. So you can check out her Instagram page, Michelle Tiliakos, and she talks about how not all midwives are created equal, especially registered midwives. They have a lot of restrictions. And this is what I learned when I was in the Fraser Valley Birth Network. And in talking with the midwives, I started to see both sides. I saw the side perspective of the moms trying to navigate the system. And I also saw the perspective of the midwives who want to serve, but their hands are tied for whatever reason. And the doulas who are incredibly frustrated, but they're also being told to zip it. And so that's why I became a birth advocate in the first place, was because I wasn't bound by any of those rules. And in fact, the doula community that I am a part of, we're not bound by any rules. We get to have the free reign. and we all support each other, and we all have different thoughts about other things, maybe even some controversial topics. But at the same time, we know that we are here to serve our clients who are coming to us specifically. And if we don't mesh with any one person, we then send them along. So if you're looking for a doula to support you during your home birth after cesarean, you also need to know about the limitations of doulas, because doulas who don't support home birth after cesarean because of their own liability or fear can be kind of detrimental. They will bring their fear into the room. You want someone who absolutely loves supporting someone who has a home birth after cesarean, someone who lights up and says, yes, take back your power, girl. You got this. So one more thing, as we are getting close to the end, is that you probably are wondering, is home birth after cesarean even right for you? Well, that depends. Home birth after cesarean is right for you if you want absolutely no medical control in your birth. So if you are planning a VBAC and you are saying to yourself, I do not want to be on that stupid monitor, and I do not want to have multiple vaginal exams, and I do not want to be put on a clock, and I do not want to have an IV, and I do not want to have an epidural just in case, and I do not want people telling me when I'm allowed to go into labor and at what point my baby is too big. I am going to just do this. It's home birth, or at least VBAC. And if I feel that I need medical intervention, then I'll go and get it. But I am not going to play with this conveyor belt system. My birth is too important to me, and I just cannot do it again. So that is the energy that you need to have in order to have an HBAC. Because the fact is that if you're planning a home birth after cesarean and you've never had a physiological birth before, that can be really scary because you don't know what to expect. And then the other side of that as well is that HBAC is even more controversial than VBAC. It's even more controversial than VBAC after multiple cesareans in the hospital. When you plan to have a home birth after cesarean, you are basically saying to society, I don't believe that this is super unsafe. And they will freak out on you. And they will tell you that you are being dangerous and reckless. But the fact is, you just don't want to go back to the hospital. And the other thing is that people have forgotten that home birth after cesarean is technically default. That is the default thing that is going to happen if you don't go to the hospital. Think about it. If you chose not to go to the hospital, eventually your body will go into labor, correct? Yes, eventually it will happen. Maybe it won't happen at 40 weeks. Maybe it won't happen at 39 weeks. Maybe it won't even happen at 41 weeks. But eventually you will go into labor, because that is what your body is designed to do. We don't sit and wonder, are we going to sneeze? Will we ever sneeze again? No, eventually you know that if some dust tickles your nose, even if you feel like you have to sneeze, eventually you will sneeze. Like, this is just science here. Your body is designed to birth. The problem is that society has become so controlled in the medical industry when it comes to birth that we are inducing moms at 39 weeks. When the average gestation of a first-time mom is 41 weeks and 3 days. We're not even letting them get into labor by doing that. Even if you have a 40-week due date, there's often that pressure to get things going. But you don't need to get things going. You can just sit back and trust that eventually your body's going to go into labor. And the other thing, of course, is that if you end up choosing to just stay home, eventually your body will birth your baby. Eventually that will happen. If you stay home long enough, eventually it will be to the point where the baby is coming and there's no going anywhere. Like what happened with Christine. She had planned a hospital birth because she thought at the time that it was going to be too much of a hassle to fight. And then what happened is that she ended up having a home birth anyway in a health authority that doesn't let moms have home births. So you have to understand that this is your default setting. Eventually you will go into labor and eventually you will birth your baby. And when you interfere with that process, that's when most interventions lead to more interventions. And then you have to have an intervention or a medical procedure to fix the problem that was caused by the first intervention. So if you're choosing to have an HBAC, you're also choosing to say goodbye to the cascade of interventions. You're actually standing in your power and saying, I trust my body to do what it needs to do. That doesn't mean that you don't need support during this. And that doesn't mean that you don't need some education during this. And so I want to give you about 4 books that will be helpful for planning a home birth after cesarean, or even just planning a home birth if you've never had a home birth before. So this one, Unassisted Childbirth, I have the 3rd edition here. This one will help you understand more about autonomous birth. Obviously, there's also the unassisted aspect of it because sometimes you can't find a midwife, but you're desperate for a home birth after cesarean and you decide, I'm just going to do it myself, and you can. So this book will help you with the confidence to do that. My number 1 favorite, you know it, Reclaiming Childbirth as a Rite of Passage. This one is just absolutely fantastic for teaching about physiological birth and helping you understand the context of society and getting past your fear. Ina May's Guide to Childbirth, a classic, right? This one will also help you think about birth in a new way. It has a whole bunch of birth stories from anywhere from the early 2000s all the way to even the 1970s, when Ina May had first created the farm with her group of people. So this one is still a classic. It's one of my favorites. And combining these 2 together, you're pretty much set for physiological birth. I also read this one when I was pregnant with my daughter, Painless Childbirth. It helps you understand more of a spiritual aspect. It talks about the chakras and it talks about more of the hypnosis and being able to have a more painless childbirth. It did help quite a bit. It is a little woo-woo, so I will warn you about that. And then, of course, hypnobirthing is another one. I don't have a copy of that in hard copy. I only have it on Kindle. And then home birth on your own terms. This is my absolute favorite to give to clients who are planning a home birth, especially one after a cesarean or multiple cesareans. So those are my favorite books to use for planning a home birth. And there are so many other awesome resources, but I'm going to also say this. Please do not pick up What to Expect When You're Expecting unless your plan is to build a fort with it. Okay? Like, rip out the pages and turn it into a paper airplane or use it as kindling, but please don't actually read that book because it undermines your confidence and scares the crap out of you, and it gives you nothing but mainstream advice, and it talks about home birth as something that's only for low risk moms who have never had a C-section, and low risk isn't actually a thing because risk is relative. And a lot of the high risk labels are ridiculous. I'll be doing a video about that in future on high risk. I did it a couple of months back last summer, but so yeah, I did it last summer, but I think I'm going to be redoing it because there are some things that I didn't touch on and I wanted to really get that information out to you. So stay tuned for that. I will be talking more about high risk, and you can also check the archives of our Facebook group. Anyway, before we wrap up, I just wanted to say that if you feel that home birth after cesarean is right for you, if that's your goal, if that's what you want, then it's right for you. And the other thing is that if you feel that the only thing stopping you is that you're not close enough to a hospital, there's ways around that too. You can rent out an Airbnb. You can rent out a birth house. In fact, my friend Jenny is creating the birth house network so that people who have Airbnbs available as birthing spaces can then list where their space is. And she is creating that network right now. But you can also just go to a hotel. A lot of moms do this. They go to a hotel to birth. And then you've got unlimited hot water. So bonus, right? If you have a small hot water tank and you want unlimited hot water, then go to a hotel and rent out one of their giant tubs or something like that. Get a room with a big tub and just stay for a couple of nights and just enjoy and relax. Or bring your birth pool and use the unlimited hot water that way. But that's one of the bonuses to using a hotel. And another option that a couple of my friends have used is going to a family member's house. You can even ask your doula. Sometimes doulas rent out their basement suites or they have a space available for you to birth. Midwives also can sometimes have birth houses available. And some midwives even let you birth in their house. So depending on where you are, you may have more options than you think you do. And hospital doesn't have to be the only place you're allowed to go. All right, so that's all I have for you about HBAC. And I will be talking more on this topic in the future. But if you love this video, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. I'm building this channel so that in the future, when someone has a question in a mom group and you know the answer and you know that something can help them, you can just quickly send a video. Rather than doing the exhausting work of trying to teach them everything or try to dig up an article, you'll just have a video that you can quickly send them to. And then, of course, always invite them to this Facebook group, because this is probably the only natural birth group that I know of that has 100% accurate information on physiological birth, doesn't have a lot of those scare tactics, doesn't have a lot of that misinformation, and doesn't create that culture of fear. And of course, you get free childbirth education every single week. So total bonus. And yeah, just keep inviting people to this group. All right, so I will see you next week. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned a lot about HBAC. I will talk to you soon. See you later.